It was September 7th, 1993, the Tuesday after Labor Day. My friends and I had spent the long weekend camping near Twin Pines Reservoir, a secluded spot off a back road deep in northern Idaho. The air was cool, the summer crowds were gone, and we practically had the place to ourselves. 3 nights of campfires, swimming, and hiking had been great, but now it was time to head home. Everyone had packed up their gear, and we said our goodbyes before driving off separately. I wasn't quite ready to leave, though. The quiet of the area, the stillness of the lake, and the crisp mountain air felt too good to rush away from. I decided to take one last hike before hitting the road. The trail I chose wasn't far from the campground, a rugged path that wound around the lake and connected to an old, overgrown jeep trail called Rockslide Road. It led to a smaller reservoir down below, a private utility lake owned by the local power company. The hike down was peaceful. The sun filtered through the pines, the scent of warm earth and evergreen heavy in the air. Occasionally, I'd hear the distant chatter of birds or the rustling of squirrels darting through the underbrush. By the time I reached the smaller lake, the sun was high and the water sparkled like glass. I sat for a while on a large rock near the shore, letting the quiet settle over me. When I finally started heading back, the serenity of the moment began to wear off. The return trail was steeper, and the midday heat made the climb harder than I'd expected. The path was narrow and rocky, with tall pines lining both sides. About halfway up, I saw someone standing in the middle of the trail ahead. The man was older, maybe mid-60s, with white hair and a muscular build. He wore a dark flannel shirt and jeans, looking like he belonged in the woods. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, like he'd been waiting. As I got closer, I noticed a jeep parked on a slope above the trail, partially hidden by the trees. Another man, younger and thinner, stood by the jeep, watching us. When I reached the older man, I nodded and slowed down to pass. His expression was neutral, almost unreadable. I could feel his eyes on me, sizing me up. I felt a pang of unease but tried not to show it. He glanced at my backpack, where my last name was stitched in small letters near the top. He said something about my name sounding German, though his tone wasn't friendly. It wasn't outright hostile either. It was something in between, like he was testing the waters. I nodded, giving a short response, hoping to keep moving, but he didn't step aside. Instead, he called up the hill to the younger man, saying something about me being with them. I froze when the younger man smirked, pulled up his shirt, and showed me 2 huge swastika tattoos stretched across his stomach. The ink was crude but unmistakable. My stomach sank, and I forced a smile, acting unfazed. The older man didn't seem to notice or care about my discomfort. He started talking about guns, casually mentioning how they'd been shooting at some makeshift range nearby. He gestured up toward the jeep, and I saw the younger guy get in and start maneuvering it down the rocky incline. The older man turned away to guide him, and I seized the chance to slip past. My legs felt heavy as I hurried up the trail, but I forced myself to keep moving, trying to stay calm. Just when I thought I was clear, I heard the low rumble of engines behind me. I turned to see 2 more jeeps crawling down the hill, their tires crunching over loose rocks. Both were packed with men, bearded, tattooed, and scowling. None of them looked friendly. I nodded as I passed each vehicle, offering a quick smile, but no one returned it. They didn't say anything either, just stared. My heart was pounding by the time I made it out of their sight. The trail felt longer now, every shadow and sound sharpening my senses. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me. The trees seemed to close in, their tall trunks stretching endlessly in every direction. It was too quiet. When I finally reached the dirt road where I'd parked my car, my breath came fast and shallow. My car was the only one left. My friends were long gone. I jumped in and locked the doors, my hands shaking as I started the engine. As I backed out onto the narrow road, I saw movement in my rearview mirror. One of the Jeeps had come out of the trail behind me, its headlights catching the dust I'd kicked up. My pulse quickened as I drove away, glancing in the mirror every few seconds. The Jeep followed for about a mile, staying just far enough back to keep me guessing. Finally, at a fork in the road, the Jeep turned off, disappearing into the woods. I let out a shaky breath but didn't slow down until I was back on the highway. Even then, I couldn't relax. The whole drive home, I kept thinking about those men. The tattoos, the guns, the way they'd looked at me like I didn't belong. By the time I reached my apartment, it was dark. I locked the doors, drew the curtains, and double-checked the locks again before going to bed. I tried to convince myself it was over, that I'd gotten away safely, but sleep didn't come easy. For weeks after, I found myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see one of those Jeeps in my rearview mirror or parked on my street. I stopped hiking alone and avoided remote trails altogether. The woods, which had always felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a place I couldn't trust. I never saw those men again, but their faces and those tattoos are burned into my memory. The way they stood there, silent and staring, felt like a warning I didn't fully understand. Maybe I got lucky that day, or maybe they just weren't in the mood to take it further. Either way, I'll never forget how close I came to something I didn't want to imagine. Camping in the fall has always been a peaceful escape for me. I love the crisp air, the golden leaves scattered across the forest floor, and the soft crackling of the campfire as the day fades into night. I've been doing it for years, setting up my little tent, enjoying the simplicity of life away from home, and drifting off to the soothing sounds of nature. But one trip in the fall of 2019 was different in a way that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. I had driven out to a state forest in northern Michigan. The area was known for its thick woods, remote campsites, and serene lakes. It was the kind of place where you could go days without seeing another person. I'd chosen a site near the edge of the forest, far from the main camping loops. The isolation was part of the appeal, just me, the trees, and the wild. The first day was uneventful, even relaxing. I set up my tent, gathered some wood for the fire, and spent the afternoon hiking along a nearby trail. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the rustling of small animals. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped quickly. I pulled on a heavy jacket, lit the fire, and cooked a simple meal. By the time I climbed into my sleeping bag that night, I felt at peace. I fell asleep easily, but something woke me up in the early hours of the morning. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. The fire had burned down to embers, and the tent was pitch black. I lay still, listening. That's when I heard it. A loud, snorting, huffing sound, like something breathing heavily just outside my tent. My heart raced. It was close, too close, and I couldn't see a thing. The sound reminded me of a pig rooting around or a bear sniffing for food. My brain immediately jumped to worst-case scenarios. I knew bears were rare in this area, and pigs weren't native at all, but it didn't stop the fear from rising in my chest. I stayed completely still, barely daring to breathe, straining my ears to hear more. The huffing continued for what felt like an eternity before fading into the distance. Whatever it was, it moved away, and eventually the forest fell silent again. I didn't sleep much after that. Every little noise outside made me jump. When morning finally came, I stepped out of the tent cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of what might have visited me during the night. The ground was covered in a thick layer of leaves, and I couldn't see any tracks. There were no overturned rocks or scratches on nearby trees, either, nothing to indicate a bear had been there. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was probably just a raccoon or some other small animal. They could be noisy at night, and maybe my half-asleep mind had exaggerated the sound. The second day went smoothly. I spent it fishing at a nearby stream and exploring some old logging trails. I was more tired than usual, thanks to the restless night, but I still enjoyed the solitude. As the sun started to set, I made my way back to camp, gathering more wood along the way. This time, I was more careful about storing my food. I packed everything into a bare canister and stashed it far from the tent, just in case. That night, the forest seemed louder. I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, and even the distant howl of a coyote. As I lay in my tent, I thought about the snorting sound from the night before. It had felt so real, so close. My rational mind told me it was just a raccoon or a deer, but a part of me couldn't shake the unease. Sometime after midnight, I woke up again. The sound was back, snorting, huffing, breathing. It was louder this time, and there was no mistaking it. It wasn't my imagination. The thing was circling my tent, its footsteps crunching softly on the dry leaves. I froze, gripping my sleeping bag tightly, unsure of what to do. My mind raced through my options. If it was a bear, making noise might scare it off. But if it wasn't, would noise just attract its attention? I stayed still, listening. The huffing grew louder, closer. I could hear it sniffing at the tent, the faint sound of air rushing in and out of its nostrils. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. I lay there in the dark, holding my breath, waiting for it to return, but it didn't. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I felt groggy and on edge. I checked the area around my tent again, hoping to find some clue about what had been out there. But just like the day before, there was nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign of any animal. It was frustrating. I hated not knowing what I was dealing with. Before packing up my camp, I decided to do some research. I pulled out my phone and started looking up animal sounds in the area. That's when I stumbled across something surprising. Raccoons. I knew they were common, but I hadn't realized how noisy they could be. According to what I read, raccoons can make a variety of sounds, including huffing and snorting noises that resemble pigs. They're also notorious for scavenging campsites at night. It all clicked. The first night, I'd heard something sniffing around my tent. The second night, I'd noticed the sound moving and circling. It made sense. Raccoons were the most likely culprits. They were probably drawn to the smell of my campfire or the scraps of food I might have left behind. While the realization didn't completely erase my unease, it was comforting to have a logical explanation. As I packed up my gear and prepared to leave, I couldn't help but laugh at myself. 2 sleepless nights, all because of a few raccoons. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the whole experience was off. The sounds had felt too deliberate, too close. But in the light of day, it was easier to dismiss those thoughts. I drove away from the campsite, grateful for the escape and the story I'd have to tell. Even now, years later, I think about that trip whenever I hear strange noises at night. The rational part of me knows it was just raccoons, but there's a small, nagging part that wonders. It wasn't the sounds themselves that unsettled me. It was the feeling of being watched, of something intelligent and deliberate moving just out of sight. And that's a feeling I'll never forget. Setting up my car camping spot was always a mix of excitement and routine. I'd been doing this solo for years, and I had my system down to a science. 2 tents, one for sleeping, one for gear, had become my standard setup. It wasn't just about convenience anymore. It was also a safeguard, a decoy, something to make me feel less like a woman camping alone. After a couple of unsettling encounters with overly curious campers, I wasn't taking any chances. This time, I was in central Ohio, tucked into a quiet state forest in late October. The crisp air and golden leaves made it feel like the perfect getaway. I parked my car in a small clearing near the edge of a marked campsite and started setting up my tents. The sleeping tent was small, just big enough for me and my sleeping bag. The other was larger, where I stored my cooler, camping stove, and extra gear. By dusk, my little camp was cozy, and I felt good about the spot. Far enough from the road to feel secluded, but not so remote that I couldn't find help if I needed it. The night passed without issue. I sat by a small fire, read a book, and eventually crawled into my sleeping bag. A chill settled over the camp as the fire died down, and the sound of leaves rustling in the wind lulled me to sleep. The next morning, I decided to go for a hike. There was a well-worn trail a short walk from my site, marked with a wooden sign that read, "Ridge Trail, 6 miles." It seemed manageable even for someone like me who wasn't an expert hiker. I packed my day bag with water, a granola bar, and my phone, though service was spotty in the area. I also brought a small compass, something I'd started doing after an experience years ago when I got turned around in another forest. I locked up the car, made sure the tents were zipped, and headed out. The trail was beautiful, lined with trees in full fall color. The crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant sound of birds made it feel peaceful, almost meditative. I lost track of time as I walked, pausing occasionally to take in the view or snap a photo. The trail was well marked at first, with blazes on the trees every few hundred yards. But as I got deeper into the forest, the markers became less frequent. About an hour in, I came to a fork. One path looked more worn, but it didn't have a marker. The other was overgrown but had a faint blaze on a tree just ahead. I hesitated. The logical choice seemed to be the marked path, but something about the overgrown trail intrigued me. Maybe it was the promise of solitude, or maybe I just wanted a bit of adventure. Whatever the reason, I chose the less traveled path. First, it was fine. The trail narrowed but was still discernible, winding through a denser part of the forest. But after another half hour, it became clear that I wasn't on an official trail anymore. The path was fading, and I couldn't see any more markers. I considered turning back, but the thought of retracing my steps felt daunting. I was sure I could find my way out if I kept going. I had my compass, after all. Another hour passed, and I was officially lost. The forest around me was dense, the trees pressing in from all sides. I couldn't hear any sounds of civilization. No cars, no distant hum of activity, just the occasional rustle of wildlife. I tried not to panic, reminding myself that I'd been in worse situations before. Still, the sinking realization that I didn't know where I was or how to get back to my campsite started to weigh on me. I took out my compass and tried to orient myself. The problem was, I didn't know which direction I'd come from anymore. I'd been zigzagging through the woods, and the sun, which had been my guide earlier, was now obscured by thick clouds. I chose a direction and started walking, hoping I'd come across a trail or a landmark. Time seemed to stretch as I wandered. The forest began to look the same in every direction, endless trees and fallen leaves. I rationed my water and told myself to keep moving. I had my phone, but with no service and a dying battery, it was more of a liability than a help. The fear started creeping in as the sky darkened. I knew I didn't want to be out here after dark. Finally, after what felt like hours, I heard something, faint at first, but unmistakable, the distant sound of a car engine. I followed the noise, moving as quickly as I could without tripping over roots and rocks. The sound grew louder until I stumbled onto a narrow dirt road. Relief washed over me as I realized I'd found a way out of the forest. But the relief was short-lived. As I stood there, trying to decide which direction to take, I saw a house up ahead. It was small and weathered, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. Smoke curled from the chimney, and an old pickup truck was parked in the driveway. Normally, I'd have been glad to see signs of life, but something about the place felt off. The yard was cluttered with random items: rusted tools, a broken-down mower, and what looked like a pile of animal bones. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there. I decided to head the other way down the road, hoping to find a less unsettling place to ask for help. But as I turned, I heard a door creak open behind me. My heart sank. I didn't want to look back, but I could feel eyes on me. I quickened my pace, pretending I hadn't noticed. The gravel crunched loudly under my boots, each step feeling slower than the last. The sound of footsteps followed, deliberate, heavy. I didn't run. I didn't want to give them a reason to chase me, but I walked as fast as I could. My breath was shallow, my chest tight with fear. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and I thought maybe they'd gone back to the house. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure stood by the edge of the trees, watching me. I kept walking, not daring to stop or look back again. Eventually, the road widened, and I saw a highway in the distance. I broke into a run, not caring about the noise anymore. When I reached the highway, I flagged down the first car I saw. The driver, an older woman, looked concerned but didn't ask too many questions. She drove me to the nearest gas station, where I finally felt safe enough to catch my breath. That night, back at my campsite, I packed up my things and left. I didn't sleep, didn't eat, just drove straight home. The experience shook me in a way I hadn't expected. I'd always thought of myself as prepared, capable of handling anything the wilderness could throw at me. But this was different. This wasn't about nature. It was about people. And the scariest part? I'll never know who that person was or what they wanted. I had always loved the outdoors. Growing up in the city, surrounded by noise and people, I longed for the quiet serenity of nature. That's why, when I had a weekend off from my job as a mechanic in Brisbane, I decided to escape to the wilderness for some solitude. I wasn't one for group camping. I preferred the quiet of being alone, with only the sounds of the forest and the crackle of a fire. I drove my old 4x4 Outtro out of the city, leaving the endless suburbs behind. The air grew fresher as I passed through the more rural areas, and before long, I was on the edge of the Great Dividing Range. The plan was simple: find a secluded spot in the forest, pitch my tent, and enjoy the peace of the wilderness for a few days. I parked the Outtro near a small, empty camping area on the outskirts of a national park. The site wasn't marked on any tourist maps, and I hadn't seen another vehicle on the way in, which suited me just fine. It was a place I'd found a few years ago when I'd gone off track during a hike. I had stumbled onto a creek that ran through the valley, bordered by thick, dense forest. There, I'd set up camp and spent a quiet night, completely disconnected from the world. I set up my tent near the creek and gathered wood for a fire. The evening was mild, and the forest around me felt untouched, like it hadn't seen human feet in decades. After getting the fire started, I sat by the warm glow, staring into the flames as the last light of the day faded into darkness. It was peaceful, almost unnervingly so. As the night wore on, I began to feel a sense of unease. At first, I chalked it up to the isolation. After all, it's not every day you find yourself alone in the wilderness, miles from any form of civilization. But as the fire crackled and the night grew colder, the feeling didn't fade. Instead, it grew stronger, like something wasn't quite right. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling only intensified. Every small sound seemed louder: the rustling of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the occasional crack of a branch. My eyes darted around the camp, scanning the tree line, but I saw nothing. Still, that sense of being watched crept over me. I couldn't help but glance nervously at the shadows around the campfire. I checked the time, 10:30 p.m. It wasn't late, but I was exhausted from the long drive and the physical effort of setting up camp. I decided to call it a night and crawled into my tent. I zipped the door shut, leaving only the smallest crack for ventilation. It was warmer inside than I expected, and I settled into my sleeping bag, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard it. A soft rustling, not from the wind, but from something moving in the underbrush near the camp. At first, I dismissed it as an animal, a kangaroo or a wombat, perhaps. But the noise didn't stop. It came in irregular bursts, like something pacing back and forth just outside the light of the fire. My heart began to race. It was too loud to be an animal, too deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight from the side of my bag and pointed it toward the tent opening. The beam sliced through the darkness, but there was nothing there. I lay in silence, waiting. The rustling stopped for a moment, and I thought it was just my imagination. But then, faintly, I heard something else. A soft, slow drag of what sounded like footsteps. I froze. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't trying to hide. The footsteps were heavy, too heavy to be any animal I knew. I kept my flashlight aimed at the tent opening, too scared to look directly out into the dark. I had read about wild animals before, but none of them acted like this. I thought about grabbing my phone to call someone, but the idea of moving made my body stiff with fear. I listened, holding my breath, the silence between each step making my heartbeat feel louder. The footsteps grew closer. The sounds seemed deliberate, like they were trying to draw my attention. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my fingers trembling as I gripped the flashlight harder. Then, just as I was about to convince myself to leave the tent and check what was going on, the footsteps stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the sound. It felt like something was standing right outside, just waiting. Minutes stretched by, or maybe it was hours, I couldn't tell. I remained in my tent, barely breathing, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt that something was wrong. No animal would stand still like that for so long. I needed to check it out. I slowly unzipped the tent, just a crack, keeping the flashlight in hand. The beam of light cut through the blackness, revealing the trees just beyond the firelight. My heart raced as I scanned the area. Nothing. Just the trees, the shadows, the thick underbrush that made it hard to see more than a few feet beyond the fire. I felt ridiculous. There was nothing out there. Nothing at all. I was just being paranoid. But as I started to zip the tent back up, I heard a low sound, almost like a cough or a grunt, from the other side of the campsite. My heart skipped a beat. It came from the opposite side, deeper in the forest near the creek. I froze, unable to move. The noise wasn't an animal. It was too human. I grabbed my keys from the ground and bolted out of the tent. My mind raced, adrenaline surging through my veins. I ran for my truck, not caring if I looked foolish or not. Whatever was out there was real, and it was close. I fumbled with the keys as I reached the Outtro. The flashlight fell from my hand, and I cursed under my breath. The sound of movement was now unmistakable. Something was coming closer. I felt it. The crack of a branch underfoot, the soft shuffle of shoes on gravel. Just as I opened the door of the Outtro and was about to jump inside, I saw it, a figure, crouched low in the shadows, just at the edge of the firelight. I couldn't make out details, just the shape of a person, too still, too quiet. Panic shot through me, and I slammed the door shut. I didn't care about anything anymore, only that I needed to get out. I threw the truck into gear and sped off, not looking back, the sound of my engine drowning out everything else. As I drove, the forest seemed to close in around me. The road ahead was nothing but a dark, twisting line. I didn't dare stop, didn't even think about pulling over for a break. It wasn't until I reached the nearest town, a small place called Woodford, that I pulled into a service station. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, my heart still pounding in my chest. I stayed at the station for a while, drinking coffee and trying to steady myself. I didn't know what had happened that night. It could have been some strange person, a backpacker who had lost their way, or someone far more sinister. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something much darker. I never went back to that campsite again. It was one of those nights where the rain didn't stop. It wasn't the kind of drizzle that you could ignore. It was the heavy, unrelenting downpour that kept pounding the ground in thick, rhythmic sheets. The kind of rain that makes everything feel isolated, like the world outside is being wiped away. I worked a night shift as a woodsman, which meant long hours in the woods maintaining trails and marking trees for logging. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid decently, and it gave me plenty of time to think, sometimes too much time. My cabin was on the edge of a dense forest, deep in the Appalachians, far from any real civilization. The nearest town was a 2-hour drive, and the only company I had out here were the occasional deer, squirrels, and the odd fox. That night, I'd been working on some trail markers further up the mountain. The storm had caught me off guard. The weather forecast had been clear, but that wasn't unusual for these parts. The mountain always had a way of keeping secrets, and the storm was just another one of them. I had parked my truck at the edge of the trailhead, my only source of warmth and comfort. The cabin was back down the road, but I wasn't about to make the drive in the middle of a downpour. The storm had soaked everything in minutes. My jacket was drenched, and even my boots had started to feel heavy from the constant rainwater pooling inside. It wasn't the worst weather I'd worked in, but it was close. I'd spent a good part of the afternoon marking some trees near a ridge, but as night crept in, I figured it was time to head back to my truck. The rain didn't show signs of stopping, but I wasn't worried. I knew the woods around here like the back of my hand, and the roads, though rough, were manageable. The night was calm, save for the rain and the occasional crash of thunder in the distance. As I made my way back down the trail, though, something felt off. It was that strange feeling you get when you're being watched, like a shadow creeping up just out of sight. It wasn't the animals. I knew their sounds too well. This was different, something human but wrong. The air felt colder, and the steady rhythm of rain suddenly seemed too loud. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves after a long day. But the feeling didn't go away. I pulled my hood tighter, adjusting the straps of my backpack as I moved deeper into the woods. My flashlight barely cut through the heavy rainfall, and the trees loomed around me like dark sentinels, their branches swaying in the wind. The trail was familiar, but the storm had made everything look different. The steady hum of the rain made the world seem muffled, and the sounds of the forest felt distant. There were no animals stirring, no rustling leaves or distant howls, just the rain. My boots splashed through puddles, and every step seemed to echo louder than it should. I rounded a bend in the trail, and that's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. Not the soft padding of animal feet, but the deliberate crunch of boots on wet ground. I froze. My heart slammed against my ribs, and I instinctively reached for the hunting knife I kept on my belt. I wasn't paranoid, but I knew these woods, and I knew what could be out here. Bears, wildcats, those were the obvious threats. But there was always the chance of someone wandering off the trail or someone hiding out here for reasons I didn't care to think about. I didn't turn around. Instead, I tried to make my movements as quiet as possible, slowly pulling my flashlight from my pack. The beam barely cut through the night, but I kept it close, my thumb on the switch, ready to snap it on if I had to. The footsteps stopped. The air around me seemed to grow heavier, like something was waiting. I couldn't stand still any longer. I had to get to my truck to safety. I gripped the flashlight tighter, pushing forward as quietly as I could, but every crack of a twig or rustle of a leaf felt amplified. I didn't dare glance behind me. Suddenly, I heard something new, something that made my skin crawl. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was the sound of something dragging along the wet ground, a heavy, scraping noise that made my stomach lurch. I snapped the flashlight on, sweeping it across the trail behind me. The beam cut through the rain, revealing nothing but wet trees and slick rocks. But the sound, it didn't stop. It was still there, moving closer. I pushed myself harder, my heart pounding as I broke into a run. My boots slapped against the muddy ground, slipping slightly with each step. But the dragging sound was still there, following me closer now. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was right behind me, just out of sight. The brush whipped at my legs as I tried to pick up the pace, my mind racing. Another crash of thunder made me jump, and in that moment, I heard something I hadn't expected. Voices. Not human voices, not talking, but a low, guttural sound, like something trying to speak but unable to form words. I was almost to my truck when I felt something brush against my leg, cold and wet, like a hand in the dark. I didn't dare look down. Instead, I pushed myself forward, sprinting the final stretch toward the trailhead. My truck was just up ahead, its headlights dim through the misty rain. I reached for the door handle, and that's when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps stopping behind me. The dragging sound stopped too. I turned around, but there was nothing. The trail was empty. I exhaled, not realizing I'd been holding my breath until my chest burned. My truck felt like a fortress as I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it quickly. The engine roared to life, and I didn't wait for a second longer than I had to. My tires spun on the slick gravel as I pulled out of the trailhead, heading back down the mountain. As I drove, I tried to calm myself down, telling myself I'd imagine the whole thing. The rain had just gotten to me, that's all. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there in the woods. I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew it wasn't just the storm. The road twisted ahead of me, slick and winding, but I didn't stop. Not until I was back at my cabin. I parked, cut the engine, and sat there in the quiet of the truck for a while, staring out into the rain. The trees around me swayed in the wind, but the feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. Something was out there. I wasn't imagining it. I gathered my things and stepped out into the rain. But as I walked toward the door of the cabin, I heard it again. The dragging sound, faint but unmistakable. It was close. I reached for my pocket knife, but just before I could pull it out, the sound stopped. There was nothing there, just the rain and the sound of my own breath. I stood there for a moment, frozen in place, listening, but nothing came. Eventually, I stepped inside the cabin, locked the door behind me, and sank into the chair by the fire. But I didn't sleep that night, and I didn't go back to the woods for a long time. The next morning, I took a look around the cabin, checking the windows and the locks. Everything seemed fine, but I noticed something strange. Muddy footprints near the back door. They were fresh. Whoever had made them had been close, too close. I didn't go back up the mountain after that. Instead, I made my living doing odd jobs around the cabin, working on small projects. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I never did find out who or what was following me that night in the woods. But I knew this, it was real, and it was still out there. Every now and then, when the rain starts to fall and the storm rolls in, I hear that dragging sound in the distance, just before I close my eyes. I never go back into those woods. I wasn't a seasoned camper, but the idea of getting away from the noise of everyday life felt like the perfect escape. It was the middle of autumn in 2023 when I decided to head out to a remote spot in the Appalachian Mountains for a weekend camping trip. I wasn't planning on anything too extreme, just me, my dog, and the woods. My dog, a golden retriever named Scout, was more excited than I was. She had a way of making everything seem like an adventure, no matter how small the task. As we packed up the car that morning, the air was crisp, and the trees were turning the kind of red and gold that seemed almost unreal, like something out of a picture book. Scout's tail wagged non-stop as I loaded the gear, and I felt a surge of anticipation myself. It had been a while since I had taken time to really disconnect, and I was looking forward to it. The drive took me about 3 hours, deep into the mountains. The last stretch was a bumpy, dirt road. I could barely see the trail ahead, and the trees were thick on either side, their trunks twisting in strange shapes as they climbed toward the sky. As I pulled up to the campsite, I noticed there were no other cars in sight. It was perfect. The first task was setting up the tent. I had no trouble with that, despite being a bit out of practice. As I hammered the stakes into the earth, Scout pranced around me, sniffing the ground and occasionally barking at something in the distance. I couldn't help but laugh, but there was a part of me that was unsettled by how quiet it was. Normally, when you camp, there are at least a few other campers around, or wildlife making noises in the distance. But here, nothing. Just silence, save for Scout's occasional barks. The first night passed without incident. I made a small fire and cooked a simple meal. Scout kept her distance from the fire, as she always did, lying a few feet away with her head on her paws, watching the flames dance. The night was colder than I had expected, and I pulled my jacket tighter as the stars above shone bright and clear. There was no wind, and the silence in the air was almost suffocating. It wasn't a normal quiet. It was as if the whole forest was holding its breath. As the fire crackled and I finished my meal, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Scout kept her eyes on the trees, ears twitching as though listening to something I couldn't hear. She wasn't scared, just alert. That made me uneasy. I figured I was just being paranoid, and as the night wore on, I eventually crawled into the tent. Scout followed, settling down beside me on her mat. The first few hours of sleep were uneventful. I drifted in and out of a light slumber, the warmth of the sleeping bag making it hard to stay awake. But then, just as I was about to fall into a deeper sleep, Scout suddenly sat up, ears alert. She stared toward the entrance of the tent, her body rigid. I sat up quickly, my heart racing. It wasn't like her to be so on edge. I listened, but all I could hear was the distant rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a branch breaking under the weight of something, or someone, moving through the woods. The sounds weren't like those of animals I was familiar with. They were deliberate, too heavy, not something you would expect from a deer or a bear. I tried to calm Scout down with a gentle hand on her back, but it didn't help. She let out a low growl, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I grabbed the flashlight from the corner of the tent, trying to reassure myself that it was probably just some other camper, maybe a hunter or someone out for a night hike. The thought was comforting for a second, but then I remembered how isolated the area was. There was no reason anyone would be out here, not this far into the woods, not at this hour. I quietly unzipped the tent door, just enough to peek outside. The flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything, just the same twisted trees and the thick underbrush. Scout was now standing, her hackles raised, her body tense. She had spotted something I hadn't. I pushed the thought aside, telling myself it was just an animal. Bears were common in the area, and they often roamed through campsites. I crawled back into the tent, but I couldn't sleep. Every creak of a branch, every gust of wind made my heart race. Scout lay down beside me, but she didn't relax. It was as if she was waiting for something. The night passed, and when dawn finally came, I was exhausted. I had hardly slept a wink. The forest around me looked different in the daylight, calmer, more inviting, but the unease I had felt during the night lingered. Scout was much more relaxed now, and I took that as a sign that maybe I was just being paranoid. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to spend the day hiking around the area, hoping to clear my mind. I packed a bag with some water and snacks, and we headed out. The sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the forest floor, but the deeper I went into the woods, the quieter it became. There was no sound of birds, no chirping of squirrels, not even the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It felt like the life had been sucked out of the place. As I walked, I noticed something odd. There were strange markings on some of the trees, deep gouges, as if something large had raked its claws along the bark. The marks were high up, about 6 or 7 feet off the ground. Scout stopped beside one of the trees, sniffing the base of the trunk. She let out a low whine, and I could see the tension in her body. I walked over to her, and that's when I saw it. A set of tracks in the mud. The prints were large, too large to be from a bear, and the shape wasn't quite right. They were more elongated, almost human in shape, though far too big for any person I knew. They didn't look fresh, but they were unsettling nonetheless. I took a few photos with my phone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led into something I shouldn't be. The tracks seemed to move in a deliberate path, not wandering like an animal would. It was like something had been tracking me, or perhaps I had been following it without realizing it. At that point, I decided to head back to camp. The uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at me all day intensified. I wanted to pack up and leave, but I knew I wouldn't be able to drive out until tomorrow. It was late afternoon now, and the thought of packing everything up seemed like too much work for the state of mind I was in. When I got back to camp, things seemed normal. Scout was acting calm, and everything was as it should be. But then, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt leading from the edge of the campfire circle toward my tent. They weren't mine. They were larger, with the same strange shape as the ones I had seen earlier. My heart skipped a beat as I realized I wasn't alone. Someone or something had been here. I didn't know whether to stay or leave, but I knew I couldn't just stay here alone, especially not with the feeling that someone was watching me. I grabbed the essentials, my phone, the keys to the car, my flashlight, and began to pack up the tent. Scout stayed close, her eyes never leaving the edge of the campsite. As I started the car, I heard a rustling noise from the woods behind me. I didn't dare look. I put the car into gear and drove as fast as I could down the bumpy road, leaving the campsite behind. The road was long, but the tension in the air stayed with me. Scout was quiet now, her head resting on the seat beside me. We were safe, at least for the time being, but I knew I wouldn't be coming back here. Not to this place. The woods had a way of holding their secrets, and some things were better left undiscovered. The tracks, the silence, the feeling of being watched. It all stayed with me long after I left the mountains behind. As I drove, I couldn't help but wonder, who or what had been out there in the woods with me, and why had it been watching me? I wasn't sure I would ever know, but one thing was for certain. I would never camp alone again. I've always loved the quiet of the woods, especially when it's just me and the trees. There's something about being alone in nature, far from the noise of everyday life, that makes everything feel peaceful. I'd gone camping by myself before, several times, but this trip was different. I hadn't expected it to turn out the way it did, and I certainly didn't expect the feeling of being watched that I couldn't shake, even as the sun set and the stars came out. It was late September, the air crisp but still tolerable enough for a solo trip. I'd chosen a spot near a remote lake, deep in the woods. The drive to the campsite had been long, a solid 3 hours away from the nearest town. The road had gotten thinner the further I went, until it was nothing more than a rough dirt path barely wide enough for my truck. There was no one around for miles, no other cars, no signs of life. It was just me and the wilderness. I'd arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sky started to turn a soft orange. The campsite was tucked between two large trees and overlooked the water. I could hear the faint rustling of leaves in the wind as I unloaded my gear, setting up my tent beside a small fire pit. I always enjoy the process of setting up camp, the simplicity of it, the familiarity. As I laid out my sleeping bag and prepared my stove for dinner, I noticed the lake's water was unnervingly still. The whole place felt like it was holding its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. I didn't think much of it at first. I started a fire, cooked my dinner, just a simple meal of pasta and sausage, and watched the flames flicker in the growing darkness. I had a small lantern on the ground beside me, but I mostly enjoyed the crackling sounds of the fire and the way the trees loomed overhead in the moonlight. There was something serene about being this far out, disconnected from the world, but as the night wore on, I started to notice something off. It wasn't anything I could point to directly. First, it was just a sensation, the feeling of being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but no one was there. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The usual chirps of insects and the distant calls of birds had died down as if everything was holding its breath, just like the water. I shook it off. It's common to feel a little unsettled when you're camping alone. I'd been on enough solo trips to know that your mind can play tricks on you, especially when you're away from civilization. But as the evening wore on and the fire slowly dimmed, the feeling only got stronger. I tried to focus on the crackling of the wood in the fire, the occasional pop as a branch shifted in the heat, but my eyes kept darting to the tree line, where shadows loomed in the distance. I couldn't shake the thought that something was lurking just beyond the trees. I couldn't see it, but it was there, I was sure of it. The sound of my own breathing seemed louder now, and the fire seemed smaller, almost insignificant in the vastness of the woods around me. As the night went on, I decided it was best to crawl into my tent and get some sleep. Maybe it was just fatigue from the drive. I'd been awake since early that morning, and I hadn't had a full night's sleep in a few days. The tent felt secure, and once I zipped it up, the world outside seemed to quiet down. The sounds of the night, distant as they were, became muffled. I lay down in my sleeping bag, trying to ignore the odd sense of unease that crept up my spine. But I couldn't sleep. My mind raced, unable to find rest. The feeling of being watched was still there, only now it felt more pressing, like something was standing just outside the tent, waiting for me to fall asleep. I could hear every small movement, every shift of the wind in the trees. I listened for anything unusual, but all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. It was just the forest. It was just my mind running wild. I focused on my breathing, trying to calm myself down, but then I heard it, a snap, a twig breaking, somewhere in the woods just beyond my tent. I held my breath. It was faint, but it was there. Someone or something was out there. I grabbed the flashlight beside me and shone it through the mesh of the tent. The beam danced across the trees, illuminating nothing but the dark, empty space beyond. But I wasn't convinced. I couldn't shake the thought that something had moved. I didn't want to get out and check, but my mind wouldn't let go. Felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the inside of my tent, waiting for whatever it was to make its next move. But nothing happened. The night dragged on in a suffocating silence, and eventually, exhaustion overtook me. I fell into an uneasy sleep, the kind where your mind never fully relaxes, always hovering on the edge of awareness. I woke up with a start, the faint light of morning just beginning to creep through the trees. My head was foggy from lack of sleep, but something had woken me up. I wasn't sure what it was, but it felt like I wasn't alone anymore. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I listened for any sounds. The forest was still quiet, too quiet. I sat up in my sleeping bag, looking around the inside of the tent. Nothing. No sign of anyone or anything. But there was something that caught my attention. The campfire I had left burning had been completely extinguished. It wasn't just out, it had been disturbed. The fire pit was dug up, the ash scattered around it in an almost deliberate way. It looked like someone or something had tried to move the logs, scattering them around the site. A cold shiver ran through me. This wasn't just some random act of nature. Someone had been here and they knew I was here too. I felt the weight of it settling in my chest, the realization that I wasn't alone in these woods anymore. I grabbed my gear, stuffing things into my backpack quickly, not caring if things got jumbled. I wasn't sticking around to figure out who or what had messed with my fire. As I packed up the tent, I kept my eyes on the tree line, scanning for movement. The feeling of being watched was back, but this time it wasn't just in my head. It felt real. I loaded everything into my truck as fast as I could, trying not to panic. My heart was racing now, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the gear. I needed to leave now, but as I started the truck and backed out of the campsite, something caught my eye. In the rearview mirror, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. Person, or at least it looked like one. They were standing still, just beyond the reach of my headlights, their silhouette dark against the fading light. I slammed the truck into gear, speeding away without a second thought. I didn't look back, but I knew they were still there, watching me. The road out was long, winding, and full of turns, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, keeping just out of sight, watching me as I left. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I found a motel to stay for the night. I don't know what I would have done if I'd stayed out there any longer. Something in those woods wasn't right. I don't know who or what was watching me, but I never went back to that lake, and I never will. That night, I lay awake in the motel room, staring out the window, waiting for whatever was out there to find me.